Hi, everyone. Welcome to DBLAC's author chat featuring poet Lauren Russell. On behalf of DBLAC, I'd like to thank everybody for sharing this space with us tonight. Just for your information, closed captioning and live transcript are available. You should have the option to enable that at the bottom of your screen. My name is Angel Dye, and I am a third-year English PhD student at Rutgers, studying 20th and 21st century African-American literature with a special focus on the Harlem Renaissance, specifically rent parties. I'm also a poet and a lover of poetry, so I'm really excited about this conversation tonight. I'd like to thank Dr. Kirsten Scott for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to say a little bit about DBLAC, the wonderful organization who put this event together. DBLAC, which stands for Digital Black Lit and Composition, is an education-focused nonprofit that serves as a learning community for academic professional development, networking, and resource pooling. They support work by emerging scholars connected to fields related to language and composition. With a digital network of members who self-identify as Black and/or who support Black education, DBLAC focuses its attention on academic introduction and retention through a cluster of signature programs aimed at modeling Black feminist and communal practices for connections and coalition building. Tonight's event is one such event, one such space. You can learn more about DBLAC at dblac.org and be sure to follow them on all platforms: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of that good stuff. As I mentioned, tonight I'll be talking with poet Lauren Russell. Lauren Russell is the author of Descent by Tarpaulin Sky Press. It came out in June of 2020, and What's Hanging on the Hush, which is from Asada Press, and it came out in 2017. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, Cave Canem, and the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her work has appeared in various publications, including the New York Times Magazine and the Academy of American Poets' Poem a Day. She was assistant director of the Center for African American Poetry and Poetics, which is housed at the University of Pittsburgh from 2016 to 2020. In the fall of 2020, she joined the faculty of Michigan State University as an assistant professor in the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities and director of the RCAH Center for Poetry. So what you can expect from this evening's event is that Lauren will read 3 poems and then she and I will chat for a bit. And then I'd like to encourage everyone to interact in the chat here on Zoom and also via Twitter using the hashtags DBLAC Reading Series and DBLAC Reads Descent. At the end of the chat, there will be some time for questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A feature to share your questions throughout the chat. And at this time, I'd like to welcome poet Lauren Russell.
Thank you, Angel. Thanks, DBLAC. Thanks, Kirsten, for organizing. Excited to talk to you. Am I supposed to read?
Yes.
Okay. I think I'm going to read 4 poems from the book, and then we'll get into the conversation. By the way, I was telling Kirsten earlier, I just got my second COVID vaccine today, my second dose, but it was a 45-minute walk each direction, so I'm a little tired.
Okay.
Excited to be here.
Hopefully you're feeling okay.
So far, so good.
Good, good.
All right. I think you all know the premise of the book, but just in case anyone doesn't, 2013, I acquired a copy of the diary of my great-great-grandfather, Robert Wallace Hubert, who was a captain in Hood's Texas Brigade in the Civil War. And after the end of the Civil War, went back to East Texas and had children by 3 of his former slaves who were also sisters. And one of them was my great-great-grandmother, Peggy. And as I was typing up this 225-page document, I became really interested in what was being left out and started researching and writing into that space. So that's Descent. Dear Robert, dear Redbeard, dear specter of the great white father, dear slaveholder, dear Confederate captain captured at Gettysburg, dear dispenser of land, favors, seaman, procreator of 20 children by 3 sisters simultaneously, Dear father of the Negro League pitcher, dear farmer, schoolmaster, landlord, hired hand, grave paler, log roller, surveyor, and manure shoveler, dear singer, dear churchman and circus fan, dear reveler at brigade reunions, dear collector of sentimental poems about loneliness and redemption, dear pointy-eared like Lucifer and bearded beyond Rasputin, dear mythical Jim Crow defier, hero of my grandfather's childhood, who took him on the whites only section of the streetcar. He claimed this really happened, proclaiming, these are my grandchildren and they're sitting with me. Dear diarist, dear widower, dear lonesome hunger, dear admirer of well-formed women, dear inscrutable in the tin type beside your favorite half-claimed child, dear tallier of payments, debts, work days, weather conditions, neighbors by name and race, dear borer of wells, dear master of omission. Heard a whippoorwill holler this morning for the first time this spring. Heard a whippoorwill holler, all hands choking cotton. Heard a holler, a whimper. Heard a will whip her. Will heard a whip. Whip or will heard. Herding hers, whipping herds, sowing oats, whipping whores, stripping cane ore. Whelped her, willed her, a well and a hold, dank of the dark, of the hell of the hold. Choking cotton, caught in, a yoke and a pull, stripped and caned for. Heard her holler, caught her, held her hand to the, whipped out your, held her head to the, whipped out the billfold. Heard a whimper this spring, choked or, heard a holler, a hollowed out hold, whipped to a wheelbarrow, hell bent toward a hole, ripped from a, wrapped in a gut wrench sugar hold. Question. So how did the women feel about this? Answer. Don't guess they had no say. And you remember my great-great-grandmother's name was Peggy. Peggy rises out of sleep through the dream called blue, where all her kinfolks are wading through fields of blue. Even her father left in Georgia, her stillborn brother somehow grown, her niece who stumbled into the fire on Christmas Day and died with the vision of her white dress aflame, the aunt or uncle who ran off or was lost forever to the auction block. They are all wearing blue, blue hats, blue shawls, and in the way they sing a song with no words, deep from the gut, there is also blue. And bluely she creeps toward them in her calico blue. And now there is a dance, they are partnering for the quadrille, and the man they called Bo Peep cradles a banjo, strikes a tune, blue. And her petticoats starched with hominy water and Pris's too. And every time they stop moving for a second, the petticoats pop and Pris giggles, and in Pris's eyes are flecks of blue. The log train shakes her into waking, black then dark blue. And she reaches for her kerchief blue, and she is stumbling toward the cradle blue and cooing shoo shoo to the baby who is hollering now. One Sunday, the preacher prayed, Lord, let us all go to heaven where there'll be no log train. Hoo, 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 and a clankety clank, whoos, black smoke curling into the half blue. Peggy. That moon ain't hiding, clouds a shawl, moon's cold as brass tacked upside a night's frock. Pin your tears to her, they'll sing like chimes, or ghosts that cry. Sometimes I feel I'm almost gone. Ghosts charred in dead men's lust. Think I'm some fool, got brains of shucks, Since freedom I've been through the toughs. See, one moon casts your shadow twice, once toward the bottomland, once toward the pines. The wind's right smart, but moon, she sly. Look, lightning bugs, they spark, but they cannot catch fire. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I'd like to say, just in a fangirl moment, I absolutely loved reading this collection. So it was awesome to hear you read some of the poems. And so we're going to jump into this conversation. Of course, I've prepared some questions, but I'd also like to encourage the audience members who are watching and listening to put your questions in the Q&A function. But we'll get started. So thank you so much again, Lauren, for reading for us and for this wonderful work. And I'd like to ask if you could talk more about what you call writing into the silences and reading for absence, partly because dissent does what Saidiya Hartman might call critical fabulation in a lot of ways. It takes the facts and the historical moment of your family's sort of descent and line and history, and it offers something that might not be able to be found in the archive, something not yet seen, not yet heard or felt about the two things that you bring together. And I'm looking specifically at page 7 where you talk about writing into the silences. So can you say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, like I said, I got this, it's a copy of a copy. It's not the original diaries, which took me a year to type up. It was 225 pages, handwritten. And I just became fascinated by what was being left out. Like I said, Bob Hubert, my great-great-grandfather, would talk about his children, but not say they were his children. He mentioned Peggy, he mentioned her sister Priscilla, whom he also had children with. But when he would talk about his white relatives, he would say who they were. Brother, cousin, niece, grandniece, always identified. And I thought that was really interesting. There was a moment in the diary when he's like clearly writing to some audience. He was like, if anyone ever reads this, I skipped this page and you have to turn back. And I was like, oh, wow, weird. Like, who is this being curated for? Not me or me. So I just became fascinated in what was being left out. And also he was 2 years in a federal prison camp, an officer's prison camp. And he mentions a bunch of stuff about various Civil War battles he was in the later diary toward the end of his life, but nothing about the prison camp and nothing about being captured at Gettysburg. So that was also being left out. And I think that the silences seemed like the loudest part of the diary.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because what is not said that you sort of give voice to becomes a new kind of archive in this project. And so I wondered if next you could talk about that, like what your archival practice was like. Obviously you had the copy of the diary, but there are other documents represented here. There are photographs or sort of illustrations represented. So where did the rest of the archival material sort of coalesce from after you acquired the copy of the diary?
That was a long process. I think I started looking on ancestry.com, where you can find quite a bit of stuff, census data, death certificates, that kind of thing. And I also encountered there some like very distant relatives who've been doing their own research. But that was interesting because I heard some different stories I hadn't heard before. And one of them had also organized a lot of things, which was helpful. So that was a start. And then I sort of got deeper into it. I saw a mention of a will from this French Huguenot. And then I tracked down the will from the archive in Georgia and had them send me a copy. Sometimes I'd see mentions of things in secondary sources, like the State Convention of Colored Men of Texas, which I thought was just fascinating because they were wanting the law to be changed to criminalize interracial sex the way it criminalized interracial marriage. And that I saw mentioned in some secondary source on like history of Texas or something very general, I think, and was able to track down, there was like a published sort of minutes of it through interlibrary loan. Yeah, so it really came to me a number of ways. I was in Madison just by chance because I got a fellowship at the Wisconsin Institute of Creative Writing at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. But as it happens, the Wisconsin Historical Society has this really amazing US history collection. And I was able to find a lot of really esoteric stuff there, including like this pamphlet that had this, not really exactly history, partial history, but including all the grades and like conduct and class roles from the Georgia Military Institute, 1852 or whatever it was when Hubert graduated. They had multiple volumes of the Library of Congress's, the WPA during the Depression. They went and interviewed a lot of formerly enslaved people. They had multiple volumes of that. So I think I checked out all the Texas ones. So really it was like through a variety of means. And some of it is family stuff. The picture of Hubert and Plunk and the picture of Jesse Hubert, the baseball player, came to me from a relative who unfortunately is no longer with us. But yeah, so some of it was stuff we've had in the family a long time, but then just sort of putting the pieces together through all the other research was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of soaking all of this up because one of my quarantine projects was like ancestry. So reading this was fascinating for me because I spent a lot of last year combing through my own sort of ancestry on there and finding documents that I didn't know existed or that were readily available. So I'm fascinated by the way that you organize this new archive in order to fill in those gaps and those silences. Yeah, so once more, I want to remind everyone in the audience to drop your questions in the chat, in the Q&A function, and we'll carry on. My next question for you, Lauren, is about genre. There's a kind of storytelling that you do in this work that resists generic constraint. I identify poetry, personal narrative, history, memory, archive, genealogy, all sort of folded into one another. And if you could, please talk about why it was important for you to fold so many forms and media into one another. I think the family story kind of lends itself to that, but what was your sort of craft inclination behind that?
Yeah, I've been drawn to hybrid work for a long time. I think I kind of make the work I want to make, and I really believe that the content and the form work together. And so the formal choice is always linked to the content that's carrying it and the genre choice. I don't know, I think I've answered this question a lot of different ways. I think that, I don't know if it's true, but it's convenient to say that as a mixed race person, like being able to making one's life at intersections sort of invokes that kind of making. But for this particular story, I really think it is important that there isn't just like one route. There are all these different sort of ways of trying to make sense or make meaning or tell the story, and that you sort of get some sort of partial story from the sort of the sum of them, right? Like no single approach will get you there, but by trying all these different possible approaches, we get a little closer. Am I making sense?
Yes, perfect sense to me. And I'd agree. I feel like we get a pretty full picture, or at least a fuller picture, because of all of the different ways that the story unfolds in the collection. I don't think that like extrapolating those parts would have given us what bringing them together gives us. So yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I have another question sort of about archive. And it's, there were some places in these poems where I was like, clutching my pearls because they were surprising or at least like unexpected. And so I wonder what were some things that surprised you as you were bringing these documents together, as you were learning the sort of family histories that you didn't know before? What things surprised you?
I was really surprised throughout the entire process because the story my grandfather had told me was so different. Um, maybe that was what started me on this to begin with after getting that diary, because my grandfather had represented it as, first of all, he referred to Hubbard as being Irish, which wasn't really true. I mean, he was like a little bit Irish way back, but he also said that he took up with Priscilla, Peggy's sister, after Peggy died, but actually he was having children with both of them simultaneously. And my grandfather never mentioned the third sister, Louisa. And the way he would talk about Hubert was this almost like heroic figure who would go visit them in Waco and take him on the whites only section of the streetcar. And my grandfather claimed, as I read in the poem, he'd say, "These are my grandchildren and they're sitting with me." I guess I'm curious as to why did we find it necessary to remember this person this way, or to sort of build these kind of mythologies around this much more complicated and fraught figure? Yeah, so I think that was one of the major things that sort of surprised me. A sort of smaller surprise, but it was strange, was when I discovered that one of the daughter, Louisa, seemed to have married her ex-stepfather, her mother's former husband, which I found a marriage certificate. And I still don't know what to make of that. It's so strange. I kind of don't know any other way to read it, but there was no greater context for how that might have happened. So
that was one of the moments in the collection that also surprised me. That was one of my clutch my pearls moments. And I could kind of read your surprise there on the page, which I think is important too, that we sort of see you going through this process of discovery even as the work unfolds. So yeah, that was shocking, but also nice. I don't know, pleasant in some way. I think that sort of delight of I don't know how we got here, but here we are. So my last question for you is about your great-great-grandmother, Peggy. She's really important in this collection and also in the history of your family line. And as we watch you learn about her, we also see you see the speaker at least make discoveries about themselves. And I wonder what the process of writing and compiling Descent taught you about yourself. What did you learn after, sort of writing into these silences about your family line, discovering things you didn't know before, hearing a new version of a story that you had heard before? What did you emerge with about yourself?
Yeah, I found myself really connecting, and this made me uncomfortable when I was reading this diary and typing it to begin with. I found myself connecting to Bob Hubert out of loneliness, that I read his loneliness in the diary, and I have struggled with loneliness my entire life, but particularly when I was working most intensely on this project was during that fellowship year in Madison, which was very isolating. And so I think that was something where I sort of wound up investigating my own relationship to loneliness alongside my own relationship to race and legacy. There was a part in it that was quite painful to write around the killing of Tony Robinson in Madison by a Madison police officer. Tony Robinson was an unarmed 19-year-old Black man who was shot and killed by a Madison police officer, and I believe it was 2015. And sort of in my thinking about that, at some point in the reporting, it came out that Tony Robinson had a white mother. And I was like, well, I also have a white mother. And I realized that I'd had this sort of different relationship to identity where I hadn't really claimed Blackness, or I hadn't identified myself as Black, or I'd say I'm half Black or my dad's Black or something until I lived in Madison. And it became inescapable because yeah, it's quite a racist place. It's a very, very white place. And I felt like writing that and sort of investigating that and going into my own internalized racism was, I don't know if I would say it was a gift of the book, but it was one of the great challenges of the book. Yeah.
Yeah, there are definitely places in the collection that I found heavy just as a reader, as an audience member, that I could imagine, demanded a lot of you as the writer, but also as the person through which, the vessel through which this sort of ancestral knowing is coming through. And not to be overly deep with that, but I'm also a poet, so I understand sometimes how that happens. Like the poems find you in ways you don't necessarily expect, and the result of that can be jarring, it can be emotional, but I greatly appreciate the work that you have offered to us with Descent. I so enjoyed reading this and having this moment to talk to you. I am going to stop talking and respond or ask you some of the questions that have been posed by the audience. So the first question we have here is from Bria Page, and she asks if you have any future projects in the works.
I've been getting asked this a lot. I just had a meeting with my dean last week. Yes, I had started before COVID. I guess it's a book. I had started some work toward a book pre-COVID that then, now it's just sort of like things have changed and I feel like I'm making a different book. But I had been writing about loneliness. I think all my work's about loneliness. But during that last year and a half, I guess I was working on that stuff, and then I switched to making final edits on Descent because it was coming out. And then, the last year we've been living under this pandemic, and it's been like a totally different relationship to loneliness. This is like this very profound isolation where I haven't hugged a human being in like 14 months. Like, who could imagine such a thing? So I'm still writing about loneliness, but it's from this sort of totally different orientation to it. And also during that time, I got a formal autism spectrum diagnosis, which also sort of changed how I was thinking about some of the work. And I've been doing a bunch of collaborations with the poet Chris Martin and other people around neurodivergent poetics. And I think a lot of that is also informing how I'm thinking about that work. So as I return to that project, hopefully this summer, I think it will be somewhat different from what I was doing pre-COVID, but I'm hoping by the end of the summer, I'll have a clearer answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. And I think all of us can kind of attest to the fact that everything we do after this moment will be different. Everything we do post-COVID will look, feel, sound different. So looking forward to what you offer next into the world. There's another question here from Maria Teresa Miles, and they ask, they say, I am also of a mixed race background and find the differences between how race and equality varies greatly here in the UK and to the USA. Has any of your research been shaped or influenced from these cultural and international differences? And they say, thank you.
Wait, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
Or is it nice to see it?
Yeah, they say, I'm also of mixed race background and find the differences between how race and equality varies greatly there in the UK where they are versus here in the USA. And they ask if any of your research has been shaped or influenced by cultural and international differences.
I don't know if it has, because I've been so focused on the US. Yeah, I don't know that it has, but I'm really interested to know more about, I'd be very curious to know what those differences are between the US and the UK.
Yeah, I'm also curious. So Maria Teresa, if you'd like to elaborate in the chat or by the Q&A, we'd like to hear more. This last question in the Q&A so far, and feel free to drop others if you have them, is the person is anonymous, but the question asks for suggestions for working with our own family history / archives whether artistically, scholarly, etc., they too want to dig into an ancestry project soon.
Oh, that's super cool. I wish I knew more about their project. I don't know what to. And they're anonymous, so we don't know who to ask. Does anonymous person in the Q&A want to say more? So far, they're not.
We're asking for some elaborations via chat. In the meantime, while we wait for that, I'll pose another sort of general question about if you have advice for graduate students, up and coming writers, aspiring writers, about their processes, navigating graduate school while writing. This is something I can also benefit from. I'm in the throes of graduate school and still trying to hold on to my writing practice, but obviously it's different now, right? So any advice on that?
Wow. So I did an MFA, not a PhD, so I feel like it might be different.
I did the MFA, so.
MFA. Are you doing a PhD now following the MFA? Yeah.
Yes, because obviously I just love school and never want to be done with school. So yeah, I back to back.
I think for me, like, so it was 3 years. It was like 3 funded years to focus on poetry, and that was amazing. And sort of taking advantage of the opportunities there are without totally burning out seemed like a sort of important thing. I think a thing I learned in grad school as a poet was how to support other people's projects. I think I went into it with a sort of narrow view of what was good, what was good, which is like what I would write, you know, or what my project would be. And I think that learning to support other people's projects is sort of a key thing, and sort of being a champion for other people and being a supporter of other people who may have very different goals or, you know, things they're trying to do than what you are, what I was. Yeah, I loved it. I think the happiest times in my life were like 3rd grade and graduate school. So I feel like that might be a unique feeling about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can totally agree and attest to what you're saying, that doing an MFA is a really special moment because you literally just get to focus on poetry. You just get to focus on the genre and the craft that you want to hone. It was a special time for me and I appreciated that moment. So I will take your words to heart and try and hold on to what I gathered there in my MFA program as I'm now doing this research intensive work. Yeah, that, I mean, poetry's always been my first love. So my aim is never to abandon it. We did not get any more elaboration or questions
on the family project. So then I have to give a general answer, I guess. I think starting with those websites, ancestry.com is pretty good. Family Search, I think, is the other one that's free, is a pretty good place to get a lot of like records, documents from around the world, and that sort of will give you a place to start. And then, you know, you can sort of follow where that leads. But I don't know exactly what this person's project is. Also interviewing or talking to older family members. I'm really glad I did this. I think when I was 12 or 13, my parents must have, I can't think I would have just done this. My parents must have encouraged me to interview my grandparents. And I wrote up their interviews in these little like booklets, which somebody had spiral bound. And some of that wound up being like really important research for dissent years later, because having gotten that information out, my grandfather is no longer around. So I think getting those stories while you can.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for taking this time to talk with me about your wonderful work. I truly enjoyed reading the work and also this conversation, hearing you read. Are there any ways that we can support the Writing Center, the Poetry Center at Michigan State going forward? Social media handles, any of those things?
Oh, I can put the website in the chat.
Awesome.
It's the Arca Center for Poetry at MSU, the Residential College in the Arts and Humanities.
Okay.
Next year's programming theme is Poetry of Witness, Poetry of Resistance. In the fall, we'll be doing some virtual programming for sure. So yeah, from the website, you can get on the newsletter or any of the social media and stay informed.
Okay, I will do that. I hope others will as well. And thank you everyone for being with us this evening, for joining us for this discussion and reading. Thank you to DBLAC for organizing this and inviting me to be a part. You can follow DBLAC on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at DBLAC org. I will put that in the chat. And thank you so much, Lauren, for this conversation. And I wish you all the best going forward.
Thanks, Angel. Thanks, Kirsten. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Uh-oh, we got one more thing in the Q&A before this is a follow-up. Sure. Yeah, this is a follow-up from Maria Teresa. And they said, from many white British perspectives, being Black in America seems far worse than being Black in the UK. But though racism here might be different, this does not mean that being Black or of mixed race in the UK is an enjoyable experience. There are, in their opinion, more targeted racial profiles in the UK, which are directed via hate crimes against religious groups, i.e. Jewish, Muslim people, etc. What we see in the media and via social media in the UK on US reporting of incidents is that Black heritage is a devalued form of humanity.
Wow.
Lots to unpack there.
Thank you, Maria Teresa. I remember I had, it was like an acquaintance. It was someone I used to volunteer with who was from the UK, who at some point made some remark. I can't remember it, but it was something like how they'd never had slavery. And I think I found that really strange, like apart from being totally, well, they did, and they were implicated in the triangle trade. And like, you know, so integral, so important to the transatlantic slave trade, and also to colonialism, you know, it was just a little bit bizarre. So I wonder if that part of, I'd love to have a conversation with Maria Teresa about this. I wonder if the British way of thinking about history, or they think they're not, because they're not part of US history, that there's a different, they're not culpable in the same way. I wonder if, but maybe she'll answer.
Well, hopefully you two can connect after this and continue the conversation. That's always a good place to end, where there's more to discuss. There's another thing here. Okay, they dropped their email for you. I will forward it to you. And they said that we aren't taught, I believe they mean US history or about US enslavement in any great details. But I will forward you their email address so that you all can continue the dialogue if you'd like offline.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, DBLAC. Thank you, Dr. Kirsten Scott. Imani Owen says this was great. I agree. Everyone have a great evening. Thank you again to Lauren Russell.
Thank you, Angel. Great talking to you.
You too. Take care.
Bye.